Hi, happy Sunday. I'm Olivia Mattis welcoming you on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. I'm so glad you've joined us today. Last week, we didn't have a program because I was over in Belgium for a very important Sousa Mendes celebration that was organized there. It was an amazing 3.5-day event culminating in a 2-hour ceremony, and it was really splendid. But we did have a chance to have you see a film during that time, episode 1 of Royals at War, and now we've made episode 2 available to you. Both of these episodes will be still available until tomorrow night, Monday night at 10 p.m. US Eastern Time. So today we're going to take a tour of Europe and look at the royal families and the decisions that they made during World War II. We do have a moderator today who will be gathering your questions and posing them later in the hour, and that is my dear friend Felix Pfeifle, who is an architectural designer, and he's an authority on many aspects of World War II, particularly the Habsburgs. He personally knew and interviewed and spent many hours with Otto von Habsburg. There's a whole film made about Felix in this context called Felix Austria. So I'm so glad that he accepted to moderate today's program. So Felix, please take it away.
Thank you, Olivia, and welcome, audience. I would first like to introduce our panelists who will speak today. Mordecai, first is Dr. Mordecai Paldiel, and after him will speak MARC D'ANTIN. Dr. Paldiel was the longtime executive director of the Department of the Righteous Among Nations at the Yad Vashem. He's also a well-known expert on many aspects and dimensions of the Holocaust. And he has often spoken for the Sousa Mendes Foundation. Most of you probably know of Dr. Paldiel. Next, MARC D'ANTIN will speak, and MARC is a psychologist who has an educational learning center, and he is also the grandson of the Archduke Otto von Habsburg, the last crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He will speak about his grandfather and specifically on a very intimate level about his character and what therefore we might draw from it as relates to his actions during the Second World War, which overlapped with some of the activity of Sousa Mendes in Bordeaux. Before we have our speakers, I would like to just give you an overview of what I call the royal condition after the First World War. You saw it in the film, but I don't think they sort of codified it or framed it this way particularly. It is mentioned, but I think there are two salient things to keep in mind about the aristocracy and royals coming out of the First World War. Two transformative events. The great imperial dynasties, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, were swept from power, and Russia due to the Soviet revolution. That revolution was of a magnitude of destruction to civilized life in Europe on a level that had never been seen. Even the French Revolution didn't compare to the wide-scale executions, dispossession, and oppression of the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, etc. So this was a massive threat to the rest of Europe, the notion of it spreading. And I think that helped inform or is behind a lot of the decision-making that many aristocrats and royals made vis-a-vis the other threat of the Nazis. Amid the wreckage of the First World War, society was transformed, and there remained three distinct groups of royals and aristocrats after the war about whom we'll be speaking at some point. One are the dynasties who remained on their thrones in countries with generally constitutional monarchies. And of those monarchs, say in Belgium and Denmark, Great Britain, there was the dilemma for the remaining sovereign whether to stay in the country with one's people as the Nazi threat invaded or occupied or annexed the country, or to leave into exile. Today, Dr. Paldiel will speak about those royals who were in a legitimate monarchy and remained in the country. The next group of royals and aristocrats were those who were removed from power after revolutions in 1918, but retained their vast personal estates. That played a big part in their political decision-making because their vast property, castles, forests, etc., was all they had left because they had been removed from power. So I think they navigated a lot of their interwar decisions based on what was left to them. The third category is the unique case of Otto von Habsburg. He was completely dispossessed as a prince and exiled. He was literally stateless. And so it, though he was stripped to nothing, so to speak, it also gave him a freedom to act against the Nazis in a way that few other princes did, few other people did. And we'll learn about that. Just briefly taking you through the life of Otto von Habsburg. He was born an Archduke of Austria-Hungary. He became crown prince in 1916 when his father became the last emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburgs were removed from power after 1918, and they went into, all their property was confiscated. They went into exile. And in the 1930s, when Otto von Habsburg became an adult and became active in his role as head of the House of Habsburg and the monarchist movement to restore them to the throne, he was very opposed to most notions of fascism and very certainly Nazism. He was a vociferous opponent of the Nazi regime and wrote about it extensively in articles that were published across Europe. And during this time, with the looming threat of the Nazis, his entire path shows one of courage in the face of oppression. And that is what brings us here, really. Characters like this who embody the spirit of Sousa Mendes. Otto von Habsburg, due to his opposition to the Nazis, was threatened with a death warrant by Hitler himself, published in newspapers across the Reich with orders of shoot to kill. And he fled from his castle in Belgium, which was not his castle. Someone lent it to him. He was dispossessed. And fled with millions of people, much of Europe, so to speak, in what is called in French the l'exode, the exodus. It's the greatest migration of humans in history. And they were basically pushed by the Nazis into the southwest corner of France for them to try and escape. There, Otto von Habsburg worked with Sousa Mendes to get visas for a lot of the refugees from Central Europe. later, he became a statesman in the quest to unify Europe. He gave up his royal identity and became a statesman of the European Parliament. So totally transformed the face of the Habsburg image. No longer royal, it's now political and dedicated to the service of the mission of the European Union. With that, we've seen Otto von Habsburg at the Pan-Europa Union. Why don't we turn to Mordecai, our first speaker?
Okay, thank you, Felix. So I'll be speaking about those royals who lived in their countries at a time when it was either on the direct Nazi German domination or of countries that were allied to Germany during World War II. I want to point out, I will emphasize two things. Let me just point out, I come from Yad Vashem. I worked at Yad Vashem. I was in charge of the Righteous Among the Nations department, which honored non-Jewish rescuers of Jews. So I want to point out, none of the royals that I will mention were necessarily anti-Semite. No, but some of them tried to preserve some kind of legitimacy and some, as much as possible, sovereignty of their countries. And the question is, was it at the expense of the Jews or not? So a few of the royals, like the Queen Mother of Belgium and the Queen of Romania, were honored by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. Also, the Princess Alice of Greece, which I will also mention. The other thing is, as Felix, I think, alluded, none of the royals in during World War II had any significant amount of power, like in the Middle Ages or before the French Revolution. They were controlled by political parties, and their power was very much limited. So they were royals in name. They were honored. They stood out, but they didn't have much political power. So the little power that they had, they tried to use it for what they considered the best interest of their countries. The other third remark is very strange. I don't know whether you're aware, most of the royals in Europe were connected with each other from family relations. And many of them were great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria of England. And some of them were connected with royal dynasties from Italy, from Germany, from England. So it was like a big mishpacha, a big family, but they were in different countries, and different countries had different situations. So let's start with the first country, Belgium. Well, let's look at the map. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Belgium, and then I'll be talking about Denmark. So Belgium had a king, and Denmark had a king. There's Netherlands. I'm not talking about Netherlands, again, because there was a queen, Wilhelmina, but she had fled to England. So I'm not discussing her, but she was there as a guest in England. She had no power whatsoever. Okay, so Belgium had a king, Leopold III. And then there's Elizabeth. So why do we have Elizabeth? Is that his wife? No, that's his mother. What happened was King Leopold III was the king. His mother had been widowed from the previous king, Albert, who died while while climbing on a mountain climb in Belgium. So she was a queen mother. Leopold himself is wide. His wife, Astrid, died in a road accident. So when World War II broke out, Leopold was single. Now, the Germans attacked Belgium, and of course, it was a foregone conclusion that they would defeat the small Belgian army. Leopold realized that, but he was allied with France and England, but then suddenly he made a decision to lay down the arms of the Belgian army without consulting his own government, okay? And so the people were very much upset at that. The Belgian army would have been defeated anyway, but he did it in such a way which made it more difficult for the British and the French army to withdraw and then evacuate at Dunkirk. which I'm sure you all have heard of, the famous evacuation of Dunkirk. Then later on, he tried to negotiate when the Germans took over Belgium and they established a military government. He tried to negotiate with Hitler some kind of deal which would have allowed him to remain king. It didn't work out. While he was under some form of house arrest, he married a commoner. And again, he didn't do it according to Belgian law. So he miscalculated on several fronts. He was not a scoundrel. He was not a bad person. He miscalculated. And when the war was over, he tried to regain the throne. It didn't work out. It almost led to civil war. And he had to resign and turn it over to his son, Baudouin. During World War II, his mother, she was the royalty. She stayed in Belgium. She didn't leave. And for some reason, she managed to convince Hitler that when the Nazis moved to deport the Jews, she asked directly Hitler not to deport the Jews who were Belgian citizens. Now, it just so happened most Jews in Belgium were not Belgian citizens. She couldn't ask for Hitler not to do anything against the Jews, but she figured at least she can save the thousands of Jews who were Belgian citizens. And Hitler said, okay, it's a deal. So the Belgian Jews were numbered about 8,000 out of 60,000 Jews. They were not touched until later on, until 1943. In other words, when the deportations began in 42, they were not touched. And then later on, the Germans violated what they had agreed, and they began to pick up the Belgian Jews, those who were citizens. But by then, many Belgian Jews had seen the handwriting on the wall, and they had found for themselves hiding places and so forth. And so many of them were saved from what we call the Holocaust. She was honored by Yad Vashem, and she also saved children. When the Germans picked up children and they tried to put them on the train, again, she appealed to the German military authorities, and the children were released, but put in children's home under Gestapo supervision, but not deported. So she was active in saving many Jewish children and many Belgian Jewish nationals. Yad Vashem honored her as a righteous among the nation while she was still alive. Even Yad Vashem went so far as even giving her a medal made out of gold. Usually the medals then were made out of silver. So that's the story of Belgium. So now moving to Denmark. Okay, so Denmark had a king, Christian X. The Germans invaded Denmark, and it took them a long time to reduce Denmark. It took them just one day to take over Denmark. The reason that why they invaded Denmark, they had nothing against Denmark, but Denmark was on the way to Norway, and the Germans tried to get to Norway to stop the British from placing mines on the sea, on the Baltic Sea. And so they allowed Denmark, very strange, they allowed Denmark to have the king and to have their own government and not to do anything against the Jews. In fact, until September 1943, the Jews went around their business. They went to the synagogues. They didn't have to wear the yellow star. There were no laws against them, no restrictions. That was a calculated thing by Hitler. He didn't want any trouble from Denmark. The Danes were considered Aryans, all the people up north were considered fellow Aryans. And also the Germans with Denmark, they had treaties, commercial treaties. As Germany is very short, it doesn't have enough food to feed its large population. And so it signed treaties with countries that have more food than Germans would have, proportionate to the population. And the two countries were Denmark, the other one is Hungary. So it was peaceful until 1943. But when the rumors came that the Germans were going to impose the yellow star on the Jews in Denmark, there were about 8,000 Jews, the King Christian X announced that he was going to be the first one to wear the yellow star. And where is he going to wear it? In public. How in public? Because the king used to take morning rides. Every morning, he went on his horse and rode through the streets of Copenhagen just to tell his people, I am king, I don't have much power, but there's a government here, a Danish government, and keep up your spirit, keep up the hope. The situation will change, and Denmark will be a fully free country. So these horse rides, when the king said, if they impose a yellow star, I will be on the horse with a yellow star. And that took the Germans by surprise, and they said they'll give it up for the time being, And then later on, when the Germans decided in September 43 to deport all of the Jews of Denmark, 8,000, the Danish underground, then what they did, they spirited the Jews on boats across the channel into Sweden. And the Jews in Denmark never wore the star at all. They never were in ghettos and never were in concentration camps. So that is the role of the king. So he played a good role in preserving a semblance of Danish independence, not really independence, some form of sovereignty. And he spoke up for the protection of the Jews. In 1942, when somebody placed a bomb in a synagogue there, then he went to the synagogue doing prayers, and he told the Jewish people, the rabbi, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to you. I will protect the Jewish population in Denmark. So this is Christian X of Denmark, a good king. Next shot, please. So now I'm turning to four personalities, four royalties that were in Southeastern Europe: Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, and a little country called Albania. So situation was different in those countries. Romania and Bulgaria were allied to Nazi Germany, but they preserved an independence for most of the years of the Holocaust. In other words, there were no German soldiers in Romania and Bulgaria. The Romanians joined Germany in the war against Russia. There was a large Romanian army fighting inside Russia on the side of the Germans. Most of them never made it back home. Bulgaria joined the Axis, that in other words, the alliance with Germany, on condition that no Bulgarian soldiers would be sent to Russia to fight the Russians, because the Bulgarians and the Russians are related ethnically and racially. Greece was invaded, and Greece was occupied by Germany. Actually, the occupation of Greece was between Germany and Italy. And the same thing happened in Albania, Italy and Germany. And so the Jews in Albania and Greece were in a more dire condition. So let's have a look at some of the kings, some of the royals there. So Princess Alice of Greece, guess where she was born? In Windsor Palace in London. So she belongs to the British royal family, but her parents and grandparents, it's a very confusing picture, but a lot of royals from Germany, from Italy, and a whole host of countries. Okay, but she was the queen. Actually, she was not a queen. She was a princess. She was married to a prince called Andrew, and there was a lot of turmoil in Greece before the war. There were revolutions, and the king had to flee, and she had to flee, and then they made it back. When World War II broke out and the Germans were in Athens, she happened to be in Athens. Her son was away in London. Her son was Philip later on. He was the husband of Queen Elizabeth. Not yet, but later on. She had two daughters that were married to Germans, and one of them was in the SS, and the other one was a pilot in the German Air Force. And she had other children. Now, in 1943, there was a Jewish family, the Cohen family, the family of Rachel Cohen and her sons, who the royal family knew them. And while she was in Athens, she refused to leave Greece. She invited them to stay in her manor in Athens. She set aside the whole wing, and there Rachel and her two children stayed with her in the palace. and the people in charge of the home were told not to disclose it. In fact, she changed the staff there in the home. She didn't trust the old staff. And they stayed there until the end of the war. In other words, until Greece was liberated. She herself later on moved to, when her son married Elizabeth in 47, later on she moved to England, and she died in England. But then she asked to be buried in Jerusalem because she switched her religion to the Greek Orthodox religion, and she wanted to be buried on the Mount of Olives, where a relative of hers from the Russian royalty was buried. She herself suffered from childhood from deafness, and later on she was schizophrenic. So she was a sick person. Now, this person, one son in England, Philip, fighting in the British Navy, daughter married to a German pilot, another daughter married to a Nazi, and she saved a Jewish family in her own home. And she was honored by Yad Vashem with the righteous among the nations. Here is Tilda Cohen, Rachel Cohen, you see in her yellow dress, planting a tree together with Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Here, standing on the left, he's about to water the tree that he has planted. And there's a picture on the extreme left of Philip with Queen Elizabeth. So she was honored by Yad Vashem, and I was the MC of that ceremony, and I'm standing in the back, but my picture does not appear, except a little. You see my face there, but right next to Mrs. Tilda Cohen on the left, you see a face there staring out. Well, that's me. But anyway, let's go to the next shot. Now we come to Queen Elena of Romania. Again, associated with the royal house of Greece, the royal house of England, and other royal houses. And she, unfortunately, didn't have a happy marriage. She was married to a man called Carol from the Romanian royalty. And Carol was a weak king. And after they married and they had a son, Michael, he fell in love. He had an affair with many women. And one of the women is known very much. Her name was Magda Lupescu. There are rumors that she's of Jewish origin. And he was so much in love with this Magda Lupescu, that he decided to give up the throne for her and go into exile. So he stunned everyone. Just later on, like Edward VIII, when he married Wally Simpson, he gave up the throne in England. So King Carol left Romania, and he left Queen Elena as the queen mother with little Michael. Now, Michael grew up, and by the time World War II broke out, he was the king. He was in his 20s. Romania joined Germany in the war against Russia. There was a large Romanian army fighting alongside the Germans. And Romania began to persecute its own Jews. And many of the Jews were in Romania were sent to territory that they annexed, they took away from Russia. It's called, they named it Transnistria. In other words, on the other side of the Dniester River. And hundreds of thousands of Jews were sent there to Transnistria, and many of them died because of the poor conditions and the lack of food and executions. She stood up and protested to the government, to the fascist government. And she made some statements, some very outrageous statements, that she would not stand by and allow the killing to continue of these Jews. And I just want to, and she told her son, Michael, and I will read what the queen said. She told the king, Michael, what was happening to the Jews, and that was a disgrace, and she could not bear it any longer. All the more so because their names will be permanently associated with the crimes committed against the Jews, while she would be known as the mother of Michael the Terrible, like in other words, a paraphrase of Ivan the Terrible. And she said to her son, you better get in touch with the government, the fascist government, which was headed by Antonescu, who incidentally was shot after the war. And as a result of that, most of the Jews, or many of the Jews in Transnistria, were not put to death and were saved. Now, the Germans, when Romania was about to switch sides and join the Allies, the Germans were planning to invade Romania. And they, on their mind was the Queen of Romania, Elena. They were going to arrest her. It didn't happen. The Germans did not invade Romania. So she was honored by Yad Vashem as the righteous among the nations for her involvement in the saving of so many Jews in Romania. Queen Elena. Next shot. Now, here we have a very difficult situation. We have Bulgaria, an ally of Nazi Germany. Bulgaria in 1940 makes the laws against the Jews inside Bulgaria, all kinds of laws. Jews had to wear the yellow star. Later on, Jews had to leave the capital city of Sofia, and they were sent to various places in Bulgaria. But Bulgaria held back. When the Germans demanded that Bulgaria deliver all of its 55 to 60,000 Jews to the Germans, Bulgaria held back. What they did deliver about 12,000 Jews from the territory that Bulgaria had annexed from Yugoslavia, a place called Macedonia, and there were 12,000 Jews. But the problem was that Bulgaria had agreed to deliver 20,000 Jews. So 12,000 Jews, that's not 20,000. So Bulgaria agreed then to add 8,000 Jews from Bulgaria proper. And there was, when this happened, there was a public outcry against that, not to deliver Bulgarian Jews of Bulgaria proper, who had been living there for hundreds of years, and there was no sign of anti-Semitism. And the man who took a role in stopping that is Metropolitan Stephan. Metropolitan in the Greek Orthodox Church, the head of a church of a Greek Orthodox Church in the country, the title is Metropolitan. In the Catholic Church, you would call him a cardinal. In England, maybe archbishop. So in Bulgaria, he was known as Metropolitan Stephan. And he got in touch with the king. And I want to quote to you what he told the king. The king was Boris III. He said, Boris, my son, I am not at all satisfied about you. One hears lately of many things done to our Jewish brethren. Think very hard. It is unworthy of you and of the Bulgarian people. Things have come to my mind, to my knowledge, which I would rather not believe. They are a disgrace and shame to you and the Bulgarian people. I cannot explain them to you by telephone. If you wish, come to me, or I shall come to you. Boris, let it not be too late. Pull yourself together, my son. And then he called him again, and he said, that is Stefan, said, Boris, you forgot yourself. You elude me and hide. Give the matter serious thought and uproot this demonic influence from your heart. And then he quoted a passage from the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament. Do not persecute, so that you may not be persecuted. With what measure you act, it shall be measured to you again. I know, Boris, that from heaven, God will keep watch over your actions. And, you know, Boris was very moved by what Stephan told him. In no other country would the head of a church speak in like manners to a king. And then, so Boris got in touch with the Germans and said, yes, I know you want another 8,000 Jews. I can't do it now. Let's postpone it, okay? And again, he asked for a postponement and another postponement and another postponement until the time arrived and the Russians were already there. Now, Boris died mysteriously after returning from an audience with Hitler. Again, like Leopold's father in Belgium, he went on a mountain hike and he got a heart attack and he died. After some suspicions that he was poisoned by the Germans, because he was not actually too much pro-German. He tried to save Bulgaria, you know. He tried to save it from too close an attachment to Germany. The fact is, he refused to have Bulgarian soldiers get involved in the war against Russia. And he died mysteriously. But Stefan was honored by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. I was very much involved in the case of Stefan. He warned the king, if you will deliver any Jews, I will open all the churches in Bulgaria, and I will tell my parishioners, hide the Jews in all the churches. So you're not going to get the Jews. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. So faced with this opposition by the church and also public officials, like Dmitry Peshev, the head of the Speaker of the Parliament, King Boris moved back, held back, postponed the deportation of the Jews. None of them were deported. Next shot. Now, we have this little country of Albania, which was an independent country until 1939, and then it was invaded by Italy. It had a king, King Zog. When the Italians invaded Albania in May 1939, again, May 1939, this is before the start of the war yet. But before that, in other words, from 1933 to 1939, 1933, when the Nazis came, when Hitler came into power, King Zog of Albania sent out instructions to Albanian diplomats in Germany, to Jews who were desperate to get out of Germany, and they had no place where to go because of the immigration restrictions in various democratic countries, to invite them, to give them visas to come to Albania. So hundreds of Jews came to Albania, not to stay there, but as a stopover to move on to other places. Some of them stayed there. And so hundreds of Jews went to Albania, a country that probably most of them never heard of them before. And the interesting thing is, Albania, 85% of Albanians are Muslims. They are Muslims, but they are not the kind of Muslims that we hear of so much today. They're not radical. They tolerated other religions. As I said, there are Christian churches in Albania too. And the Jews who came to Albania, they never had it so good. They were never persecuted, and Albania is the only country that had the same number of Jews at the beginning of the war as at the end of the war. There were 300 Jews in Albania at the beginning of the war, and there were 2,000 Jews in Albania at the end of the war. The other 1,300 came in during the war, and they were all sheltered and saved. When the Germans took over from the Italians and they were looking for the Jews were not betrayed. There were no betrayals. There were no denouncements. So King Zog was no longer in power, but he was a good king, and he invited Jews to come to Albania to seek refuge. And finally, the last monarch, King of Morocco. What are we doing with Morocco here? Well, Morocco was then part of the French Empire. And when France surrendered, the Germans allowed the French to keep their empire. So the French kept Morocco, they kept Algeria, they kept Tunisia, they kept Vietnam, and they kept all their colonies in Africa. But the French then passed anti-Jewish laws. And the laws restricted Jews in various professions and freedom of movement and so on. And these laws were enforced in the French possessions that they held. So when Mohammed V, who was the king of Morocco, but it's the French that we're calling the shots there, when he was told that he has to restrict the Jews and pass anti-Jewish laws, and he has to approve them, he called the leadership of the Jews to his palace, and he said, look, I am forced by the Vichy government to countersign these laws, but nothing is going to happen to the Jews in Morocco. I mean, those Jews who came to Morocco, who have been living in Morocco, nothing going to happen. You have nothing to fear. And he kept his word. And when I was at Yad Vashem, I had a delegation of Moroccan Jews who came, and they wanted King Mohammed V to be honored as a righteous among the nations. I said, bring me the proof and so on. They never were able to bring the documents because Morocco and Israel did not have any relations at that time, which was like 20 years ago. but he was a good king, saved the Jewish population of Morocco. I'm talking about the Moroccan Jews who had been living there for hundreds of years. There were refugees who came into Morocco, and these he had to put to work, to labor, to build a railroad line into the Sahara. But over 150,000 Jews in Morocco, Moroccan Jews, were not touched and were not harmed, although he was told by the Vichy government to take some measures against the Jews. So with that, I am finished with my presentation. So Felix, I'm turning the floor over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mordecai, and thank you so much for presenting that tapestry of the complexities of European monarchy and royalty during the Second World War. We turn to MARC D'ANTIN, who will speak on fairly intimate, very insightful terms about his grandfather, Otto von Habsburg. Mark, hello.
Yep. Thank you, Felix. And thank you, Mordecai, for all that fascinating background. Thank you to the Sousa Mendes Foundation for having me, and thank you all for being here today. I'm not a historian, and my role here isn't to talk about specific events or figures in a direct way, kind of in the way Mordecai just did. I'm here for two primary reasons. As was already mentioned, my grandfather was Otto von Habsburg, and I had the privilege of spending time with him and getting to know him. I've had the opportunity to have a direct connection with him, with how his philosophy of life and the world impacted my own and that of my close family. By simply being in his close orbit as someone whose life is in his shadow, I can speak to how some of his views of the world, how they impacted my own perspective on the world. To a lesser but still relevant extent, my background, as Felix mentioned, and my studies have been in psychology. So I hope to bring some insight into how my grandfather and my family reacted to the tumultuous time in Europe and how that led to who we are as a family now and what we value as a family. This is a picture of my sister, myself, and our grandfather in 1988 in New York. My grandfather, Opapa, as my cousins and I called him, figures into this documentary only briefly, but he and the family, as the modern saying goes, lived rent-free in Adolf Hitler's head. We know that Hitler hated the Habsburgs and mentions them in Mein Kampf in a way that makes that pretty clear. He wanted my grandfather dead and was so furious about Opapa choosing not to agree to a meeting that he even called his plans to take over Austria in 1938 Operation Otto. There's a scene in the documentary that has footage of Opapa attending one of Hitler's famous rallies and coming away unimpressed with the man and his words, but impressed with the effect his presence had on the crowd. He seemed impervious to this effect, which to my psychologist self is fascinating. This very fact that one could be inundated by the fervor of the crowd and be able to step outside it as a neutral observer. Although wearing the hat of his grandson, who holds him in high reverence, I'm not surprised that it didn't affect him in that way. The image I'm showing here is not the rally he attended. Aside from the footage in the documentary, I'm not sure any images exist, and I'm not even 100% sure the images from the documentary are actually from that rally. But this is a rally in Vienna following the success of Operation Otto. It's hard to see, but Hitler chose to keep much Habsburg insignia up, even while claiming to hate everything about the Habsburg monarchy. I found that interesting. When I think about Opapa at that rally, and I think about some of my memories of time with him. This next image here is of my grandparents' summer home and winter home, since we spent a lot of Christmases there, in Benidorm, Spain, outside of Alicante. Benidorm is now a busy, bustling city full of British expats. You hear more British English than Spanish if you walk around the streets. But when I was there as a child, it was a sleepy place in the middle of nowhere, which you can kind of see the background there. And at least, that's how I remember it. I remember distinctly evenings in the living room after dinner. Opapa would have a glass of tawny port, which was always his favorite, and the adults would talk politics. At the age I was in this picture, I didn't understand much of anything, but I loved being a part of the conversation, and it may have led to my personal fascination with the intrigue of politics as an outsider to this day. I remember as early as 2001 or 2002, so well after this picture was taken, he would regularly talk about Putin. He would say the word Putin mockingly. Putin was the way he would say it. But in that mocking tone, I could also hear concern. He feared what an authoritarian like Putin might mean for Europe well before others seemed to recognize the threat. It wasn't until at least a decade later, after the invasion of Georgia, the failed reset with Russia, and as relations really started to tank between Europe, the US, and Russia, that I realized how prophetic that mocking, sneering Putin was. I still hear it. Every time I hear Putin's name, I still hear his voice. And obviously, unfortunately, we hear it a lot these days. I really wonder what he would have thought of some of the strongmen authoritarians in the world today, and I'd love to have his insight into what it might mean for the future of Europe in particular. That's the main thing that I believe distinguished my grandfather from many of the royals seen in the documentary. Not necessarily the ones that Mordecai talked about, but some of the others. Many were so focused on preserving their family name, on holding on, or being reinstated into a position of power, that they gave in and in some cases even supported the atrocities that were being committed. My grandfather had some notion that perhaps our family could be reinstated, but over time, and in some way, I have to think this was true even in the 30s, given how he reacted to the rally, that he was more concerned about ideals outside of the family titles and history. His concern, more and more, was for a united and strong Europe. He knew Hitler posed a threat to that vision, and more recently, he knew Putin was a threat to that vision. And again, I can't help but wonder how he'd feel about certain figures in power in the world today. Felix, I didn't mention it in his introduction, but he and I met while I was traveling with my grandfather in Eastern Europe. He was giving talks, my grandfather, as the former head of the Pan-European Union. I think it was the time when he had just passed the title on. During these travels, I got to see my grandfather as the respected statesman he was. I had been exposed to his talks, but seeing him in person delivering powerful speeches about the future of Europe is something that will stay with me forever. But those listening and applauding weren't there because they were in awe of who he was personally, of the family he was born into. At least that's not the impression I came away with, hearing him make the rounds with admirers before and after his talks. They were in awe because his words and his vision resonated with them. The values he held aligned with their own. So I want to switch briefly to how I think this philosophy of my grandfather's has permeated to the rest of the family. I can only speak to how it has impacted his children, so my aunts and uncles, and then his grandchildren, my siblings and my cousins. That is to differentiate us from the impression I get based on my interactions with more distant family members, so that this philosophy wasn't necessarily shared by my grandfather's siblings or their descendants. The value that my grandfather lived by is that our family name and family history ultimately became far less important than ensuring a free and strong Europe. Historical events made very clear a strong Europe was to be achieved without monarchy at the forefront. I see vestiges of this value in how my family behaves even today. I have distant relatives who seem to live their lives as if their monarchic background is still something to be revered and respected just because. But with rare exception, I don't see that in my closer family. We all hold relevance for our opapa, but it isn't because of the title he was born into, but because of the accomplishments in his life. And we hold reverence for our family name because of how impactful it has been to world history. But that said, I have aunts and uncles who have gone into politics, but out of a duty to serve rather than feeling as though they're somehow entitled. We go through life as if the Habsburg name has meaning to our day, as if we don't go through life as if the Habsburg name has meaning to our day-to-day outside of its history. And I think that showcases why Opapa was so impervious to some of the reactions other royals had to the authoritarians they hoped to curry favor with. He could see the direction of history, I feel like, in a way that maybe others couldn't. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Olivia for some announcements.
Wow. And I know that there are many, many questions in the chat box. So I am planning to run this program a little bit long just to give enough opportunity to have a real discussion. I'm going to make just some brief announcements. Our next program is December 8th. It will be our last program of 2024. And on that program, we're going to be honoring somebody very important. His name is Günter Demnig. He's an artist who invented an artistic project called Stolpersteine.
Mm-hmm.
These are stumbling stones, memorial stones that are placed outside of the last place of residence of victims of the Holocaust. And it's quite astounding. There's a new film about him called Here Lived, and it starts with Mr. Günter Demnig placing his 100,000th stone. So he first thought he would do 100 of these stones, and then it became 1,000, and now it's 100,000, and he's not even slowing down. So it's just a remarkable achievement that he has made. And we're going to now see a little trailer of the film called Here Lived.
My father never wanted me to come to this country. He had told us how they betrayed the Jewish people and would say that it would be a mistake for you to even go and visit.
It is not so long ago that our fellow citizens who had taken babies, ladies, men, elderly people, they were taken only because they were Jew.
It's my mother, who is Marianne, my sister, and I think he or she is perhaps a week. I come from a family where the whole family of my mother are murdered in the camps.
Remembrance stones is Stolpersteine. Stolpersteine means, literally translated, stumbling stone.
And for me, it was the idea bring back the names. The more people step in on the graves, the higher is the honor.
It actually makes people pass by, stop, look at it, and then they realize, okay, there was a problem, there is a problem, and maybe we get rid of anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and so on.
They were all killed, except for my father and his 3 siblings. They were taken into hiding.
During the war, in a period of 1 year, between 500 and 800 Jewish children were smuggled out of this daycare, and they were saved from deportation.
Great. So I hope you will sign up for that program, or better yet, get a season ticket, which gets you access to all of our programs for next year. Now, Felix, take it away for the audience questions.
This is for Mordecai, I suppose, or Olivia. Is there any historical record that the royals, assumedly in Great Britain, historical record that the royals attempted to persuade FDR or Churchill to use their resources to end the extermination camps? Did royals lobby these statesmen directly on that matter?
Not that I know of. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I have. But taking into consideration that the royals in London, they were guests there. They didn't have any power. They didn't have anything. Some of them did call out to their citizens in the captive countries to oppose the Germans in whatever ways. So Queen Wilhelmina did that, but to FDR, I don't know of any appeal by royals. I mean, those who were outside of German hands, direct appeals by them to FDR to do something about what was happening to the Jews. Not that I know
of. And Mordecai, that is likewise my understanding. Let us, I think that's the only question perhaps I have not answered. So I'll turn to some questions I have for Mordecai and Mark. Mordecai, of the characters you spoke about, who do you think best embodies the principles, standards, or example of Sousa Mendes? And what parallels are there, including, say, Otto von Habsburg? I'm sorry, you didn't speak about him, but you know about him, but especially among your characters.
I think foremost among them, I would name Queen Elena from Romania. I would also mention Princess Alice from Greece. I mean, she had a son-in-law married to a daughter who was in the SS, and she shelters the Jewish family in her own home. So that takes a lot of moral courage, okay? And I will also mention Queen Elizabeth from Belgium. That doesn't mean that I don't have any respect for like King Christian X from Denmark. He too is a hero in my eyes. It's very strange that I have Queen Helena and Elizabeth and Alice. All three of them are women, and they showed a greater amount of moral courage than the royals who were males.
Mordecai, and you can decline this question if you want, but there's another interesting nexus that I don't think we talked about. That is, however, in the film, that let's see, well, Elizabeth of Belgium, the Dowager Queen, was the mother of the Crown Princess of Italy. The Crown Princess of Italy, married to, Umberto, as I understand it, had a very large influence over her husband in his own political, in his own relationship to the fascists.
So anyway, when it comes to Italy, I don't know about this princess. I know Italy had a king, Vittorio Emanuele. He was the king. And he was very friendly to the Jews. In fact, in 1903, he even invited Theodor Herzl, who created the Zionist movement, to come in and explain to him what Zionism was all about. And he said, yes, the Jews should have a country of their own where they can face off anti-Semitism. But during the Mussolini era, again, he was not involved in anything to stop Mussolini from harming the Jews. When Mussolini in 1938 passed the anti-Jewish laws and so on, he was very passive, Vittorio Emanuele. So I don't have anything by him where he stood up or tried to lessen the laws of Mussolini against the Jews, which started in 1938. I don't know of anything.
As regards even Vittorio Emanuele, my impression of these monarchs, perhaps by way of the nature of their constitutional limitations as heads of state, was a dynamic of a lot of cat and mouse with the Nazis. I mean, sometimes it almost seems farcical, the way they're dancing around how to, like, commit to the Nazis in one regard, but disobey their agreement with Nazis once they became members of the Axis, etc. Seems like they're dancing all over the place trying to save themselves. What do you think?
Yes, none of the monarchs of Europe had any liking for Hitler and his likes, and Vittorio Emanuele didn't have any liking for Mussolini. They all despised Hitler, but he was a strong man, and so they felt that they had to do something to be a little bit friendly or not to antagonize him too much.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yes, but they were not. They all were against him. They all hated him. And no one loved Hitler, really. In fact, Hitler had more admirers in places like the United States and England before the war than he had among the royals. I mean, about the Mitford sisters in England and and Marshley and so on. And in the United States, Charles Lindbergh was an admirer of the Nazis, maybe not of the Nazis, but they were pro-fascist. They felt that fascism was not such a bad idea. What they feared most was communism. And the big debate with Pius XII, who was not an admirer of Hitler, far away, but he felt that Stalin represented a greater danger to religion and the Catholic Church. If he should win, then Hitler, and maybe Hitler could be managed. So none of them had any admiration for Hitler, but they felt that he was a man that won one could negotiate, one could work with.
Thank you, Mordecai. I'm going to turn to some of the questions which I answered in the chat, and focus on Otto von Habsburg. Well, Mark Neugebauer asks, are we familiar with the book Hitler and Habsburgs? Yes, we are. Insofar that I did a program, I moderated a program here 2 years ago with Mark's mother, Michaela von Habsburg, and the author. And the author explores the wider Habsburg cousins and Otto at the leadership of resistance against the Nazis. A great book if you want to learn more about that. Someone also asks about, do all the Habsburg descendants ever get together? There are something like 600 to 1,000 living descendants. So there are many different branches, but I think what would be relevant is Otto von Habsburg's line, which is the senior line of the house. And I think Mark already made it fairly clear that they are a tight-knit family. And in part, thanks very much to the legacy that Otto von Habsburg left to them. The example that I think both Otto and his wife, Regina von Sachsen-Meiningen, set for their children. And so they do have fairly regular.
We're meeting in January. We're having a family reunion. The smaller group, so my grandfather's children and grandchildren, for the first time, we're all meeting in January for my grandmother's 100th birthday in her house in Germany. There's also, of course, WhatsApp groups there's a Habsburg WhatsApp group that has many hundreds of members, and then smaller groups that have slightly less. But yes, people do keep in touch, and there are reunions every once in a while.
So Felix, before we get to our final thoughts, I just wanted to make some remark about Sousa Mendes's connection to some of these families. So these are families that were not necessarily mentioned because they escaped. So for example, the children of King Leopold, the 3 children, Josephine, Baudouin, and Albert, did receive visas from Sousa Mendes. And they crossed with the Belgian government into Spain with the intention of going to Portugal. But then they were brought back from Spain to Belgium, and they sat out the war, most of the war in Belgium with their father. So they were Sousa Mendes visa recipients, which is part of why there was this big event last weekend in Brussels. Also, the Habsburg family and all their retinue got visas from Sousa Mendes. So did the Grand Duchess Charlotte of Luxembourg and her big family. They actually lived here on Long Island during World War II at what is now the campus of Long Island University. They lived in what is today the University Library. So there are many connections to Sousa Mendes helping some of these families escape. So that's fascinating to me. So I wanted now to turn to our panelists, all 3 panelists, for some final remarks, starting with Mark. Mark, what would you like to say in closing to our audience?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about certain parallels with modern day. Someone mentioned in the chat, I was reading about, will there be people who present themselves as morally courageous, assuming that certain things come to pass in January and February related to how immigrants are treated in the US? Will there be a similar group of people that can be looked at in a positive light through history? I'm going to talk about what I know. I would hope that my grandfather would find himself as one of those people who would speak out against it. Obviously, this is the US, and so it's a different dynamic. But there are lots of parallels to what's going on today, and I think that's what is most interesting.
Mordecai, what would you like to say in closing to our audience today?
Yeah, I was thinking, what should I say in closing? Well, I'll stick to royalty, but I have a different royal, again, a woman. And this is associated with a holiday that we call Purim. It happened 2,500 years ago in the Persian Empire. There was a king there. In the Bible, he appears as Achashverosh, and historians think his name was Xerxes the One. He was not a very smart king. He tried to invade and take over Greece, and in the Battle of Salamis, the Persian navy was defeated. But anyway, he loved parties and he loved liquor, and he had his first wife, the queen Vashti, killed because she wouldn't appear at the party to show the beauty before all the guests. And when he killed, after he killed, he married another woman, and her name was Esther. She was Jewish, but he didn't know that because she hid the fact that she was Jewish. She didn't know how he would react to that. He was supposed to be a very beautiful woman. And then he had a prime minister called Haman. And one day Haman decided that the Jews have to be exterminated, the whole Persian Empire. And he got the king drunk, and the king signed the edict of the extermination of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Persian Empire stretched from India all the way to Egypt, including Judea, the country of Israel, which was then known as Judea. And Esther then decided she was going to try to change that. And she did that by inviting Haman to a party at the king's palace. And at the party, she connived so that Haman took a shot at Queen Esther and made the king jealous. And the king thought that maybe Haman wants to have a behind-the-scenes affair with Esther. But anyway, he got so upset that he ordered that Haman be hanged. And Haman was hanged on a tree that he had prepared for someone else, for Mordecai, the uncle of Esther. But that's when the king discovered that his wife was really Jewish. And the edict of extermination was abolished on that day. So since then, the Jews celebrate Purim, the holiday of Purim. It's the only holiday where you are not only allowed, but you are encouraged to get a little bit drunk. It's like a carnival, a Mardi Gras, and you'll see Jews running around and dancing and acting very strange. That's the only holiday where you can really enjoy yourself beyond all means. It's Purim. But I mentioned that. Here is a queen, Esther, where she was afraid if the king was going to discover that she hid her identity from him, he might have ordered her execution like he killed his first wife. But she took the trick, and she did it in a smart way by inviting Haman, the Hitler of those days, to a party to make the king jealous to such a degree, knowing the king and his character, that Haman was eliminated and the Jews were saved. So again, things can be done. Even the impossible can be done. If you think, if you try. If you don't try, nothing happens. But if you do try, something happens. Queen Esther tried. She took a chance. So she is one of those royals that really saved her own people. And so it fits in with the story of like Queen Elena from Romania, Queen Elizabeth from Belgium, Princess Alice, and the other royals who, on top of trying to preserve the sovereignty of their country, they also tried to act on the standards of moral courage and save as many Jews as they could possibly do. That's my my final thoughts for today.
What a great parallel. Now, Felix, the last word goes to you.
Unmute. Thank you, Olivia. I am going to direct that to the legacy of Otto von Habsburg, in part because we did a program on him earlier. He is worthy of his own program in his own acts of courage during the Second World War, and particularly in Bordeaux, of his resistance to the Nazis, widely recognized, actually not until recently, by the Austrian Republic for political reasons. But his case is well documented and it's exemplary. You've got a man who has a good moral compass. And I want to note, and I think that this also plays into other royals and aristocrats who were not in government at that time, the aristocratic way of thinking is not political. So Otto von Habsburg did not look at this situation as a political question. It wasn't about like the ideology of fascism or communism. Anything else? I mean, those were the two main things. It was a question of humanity and doing the humane thing. And we can distill that principle, to a number of things at many different scales. And I think Otto von Habsburg serves as an excellent model in that regard. So that's where I would leave that.
Great. So thanks, audience, for sitting through 2 films and an extra long program today. I do hope you learned something. I certainly did. Thank you to our wonderful moderator, Felix Feifel, and our distinguished speakers, MORDECAI PALDIEL, MARC D'ANTIN. Thank you all. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. We'll see you on December 8th. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Be well, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.